What if you were told that during the filming of The Passion of the Christ, director Mel Gibson himself interrupted one of the most important scenes in the film because he witnessed something his eyes were not prepared to see? Something so intense, so disturbing, that to this day it remains one of the best-kept secrets from behind the scenes of that production. We're not just talking about special effects or masterful acting. We're talking about something that completely transcended the limits of cinema and entered a dimension that few can comprehend. Have you ever wondered why so many members of the Passion of the Christ crew refused to talk about what really happened on that film set? Why are there confidentiality agreements involving certain moments from the recordings? Why does Jim Caviezel, the actor who portrayed Jesus, to this day describe that experience with a mixture of reverence and something that looks very much like fear? The truth is that what happened during the filming of the Crucifixion went far beyond any script. It was something no one planned, no one expected, and that forever changed everyone who was present that day. Matera, Italy, late 2003. The filming of The Passion of the Christ was at the height of intensity. Mel Gibson had invested $30 million from his own pocket to tell the story of the last 12 hours of Jesus Christ in the most brutal and realistic way possible. Hollywood had rejected the project, calling Gibson crazy for wanting to make a film entirely in Aramaic and Latin, without known stars, without commercial concessions. But Gibson wasn't making ordinary cinema. He was on a mission he himself described as spiritual, almost obsessive. The crucifixion scene was scheduled to take 2 weeks of filming. Gibson wanted every detail perfect, every drop of sweat, every cry of pain, every moment of agony captured with absolute historical precision. Jim Caviezel had already spent endless hours hanging on the wooden cross that weighed almost 70 kilograms. He had already been struck by real whips that left a 35-centimeter scar on his back. He had already dislocated his shoulder when the cross fell on him during a take. And, in an incident that defies any logical explanation, he had already been struck by lightning twice during filming, once while preaching the Sermon on the Mount, when witnesses saw fire coming out of both sides of his head. But what happened that specific day during the crucifixion scene was different from everything. Sources close to the production, who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity, reveal that Gibson had planned a specific take of the moment when Jesus gives up his spirit. It was a technically complex scene, involving multiple cameras, precise lighting, and millimetric coordination between sound, photography, and practical effects teams. Caviezel was prepared, concentrated, in a state of deep meditation that he had cultivated over weeks to be able to convey the magnitude of that moment. The cameras began to roll. The technical crew, composed of more than 60 professionals, watched in absolute silence. But seconds after the take began, something extraordinary started to happen. According to reports from crew members who were present, the temperature on the set dropped drastically within seconds. People began to see their own breath condensing in the air, something impossible considering they were in the middle of the day under the Mediterranean sun. The natural light, which had been perfectly stable, began to change intensity irregularly, as if something were interfering with the very atmosphere around the set. A sound technician reported later, in a private conversation never made public, that his equipment began to pick up inexplicable frequencies, sounds that shouldn't be there, voices whispering in languages he couldn't identify. The audio meters went crazy, registering decibel peaks that didn't correspond to any visible sound source. And then, at the exact moment when Caviezel was preparing to pronounce Christ's last words on the cross, Mel Gibson did something no one expected. He shouted to stop. He interrupted the scene in the middle of the most important take of the film. Sometimes we wonder what exists beyond our physical world, and other times strange things happen that make us question everything we thought about life. In situations like this, a better understanding can mean the difference between being confused and having clarity. That's exactly what our e-book, The Secret of Jesus' Apparitions, offers. Consider acquiring this incredible material for a symbolic price. This exclusive material offers keys to decipher divine signs and understand how Christ manifests in our days. Your contribution allows us to maintain this independent research work. The link to acquire the material is available in the pinned comment. But returning to that disturbing moment on the set, the crew was paralyzed. Gibson, known for his obsessive perfectionism, never interrupted a scene like that. Never. Especially not that scene, which he had waited weeks to film in the exact conditions he wanted. Witnesses claim that the director's face was pale, his eyes wide open, fixed on something no one else seemed to be seeing clearly. He walked quickly toward Caviezel, who was still on the cross, and the two exchanged words in low voices that no one else could hear. What did Gibson see at that moment? Close sources suggest that the director witnessed something in Caviezel's face, in his eyes, in his expression, that went beyond any acting technique. Something that made him question whether what was being filmed was still just a movie. A member of the photography crew described the scene later, saying that for a brief moment, maybe less than 5 seconds, it seemed like it was no longer Jim Caviezel hanging on that cross. It was another presence, something much older, much heavier. Gibson ordered everyone to take a break. He had Caviezel brought down from the cross immediately. The technical crew, confused and frightened, obeyed in silence. No one asked questions. No one dared to question. Because everyone had felt something on that set. A presence, a force, something that was there with them and that had not been invited, was not part of the script, was not in any production plan. For the next 40 minutes, Gibson met privately with Caviezel, with cinematographer Caleb Deschanel, and with some selected members of the spiritual team he had discreetly brought to accompany the filming. Yes, you heard that right. Mel Gibson had brought spiritual consultants, Catholic priests, and people of deep faith to be present during the most intense scenes of the film, something he had never done in any other production of his career. When filming resumed an hour later, the climate on the set was completely different. Gibson had changed the angle of the cameras. He had altered the lighting. He had modified technical aspects of the scene that, according to him, would allow capturing the moment in a way that would not expose the crew to what he had previously witnessed. Production members report that Gibson seemed to be protecting something, or protecting someone, or perhaps protecting everyone from something he had understood was happening there at that moment. The final take that went into the film was recorded under these new conditions. And although the audience saw a powerful and moving scene of Christ's death on the cross, few know that this was not the original scene Gibson intended to film. It was a modified, adjusted, filtered version of something much more intense that had been briefly captured in that first interrupted attempt. And the footage from that first take? Those few seconds of filming before Gibson shouted to stop? According to rumors that have circulated for years among film industry professionals who worked on the production, that footage was immediately confiscated. The tapes were collected, locked away, and, according to some versions, destroyed by express orders from Mel Gibson. Other versions suggest that the footage still exists, stored in a safe somewhere, but that Gibson swore it would never be publicly exhibited, that it should never be exhibited. To fully understand what happened that disturbing day on the film set, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand who Mel Gibson was before the Passion of the Christ, and what led him to embark on this journey that would change his life forever. Because this wasn't just the story of a director making a film. It was the story of a man at war with himself, seeking redemption through the most brutal and honest art he could create. Late 90s. Mel Gibson was at the peak of fame. Braveheart had earned him 2 Oscars. Mad Max had transformed him into a global icon. Lethal Weapon guaranteed his position as one of Hollywood's biggest action stars. He could choose any project, any budget, any studio would be willing to finance his films. But behind this facade of absolute success, Gibson was falling apart. Severe alcoholism, deep depression that kept him locked in hotel rooms for entire days. Thoughts he would later describe as extremely dark, self-destructive, desperate. In interviews years later, Gibson would admit that he considered taking his own life, that there were moments when the pain was so great that he saw no way out. And it was precisely in this abyss of despair that something changed. Gibson, raised in a traditionalist Catholic family, had distanced himself from faith for years. But in that moment of absolute crisis, he fell to his knees. Literally. In a hotel room in a city he doesn't even remember which one, completely alone, intoxicated, he began to pray, to cry, to beg for help from a God he had stopped believing in years ago. And according to Gibson himself, something answered. He began to have dreams, vivid visions of Christ's crucifixion, images so detailed, so visceral, that he would wake up sweating, trembling, with his heart racing. But these visions didn't frighten him. They called him. They demanded something from him. And the more he meditated on these dreams, the more an idea began to take shape in his mind. He needed to tell this story. Not in the soft and sanitized way Hollywood always told it, but in a real, brutal, unfiltered way. Gibson plunged into obsessive research. He spent months studying historical texts about Roman crucifixion methods. He read medical accounts of what happens to the human body during this type of torture. He studied the Stations of the Cross. He immersed himself in the Gospels, reading and rereading every word in ancient translations. But it was when he discovered the writings of Anne Catherine Emmerich, a 19th-century German nun who had detailed visions of Christ's Passion, that something definitively solidified. Anne's visions were disturbingly specific. She described not just the events, but minute details, physical sensations, dialogues, moments that weren't in the canonical Gospels. And these descriptions resonated deeply with Gibson's own visions. It was as if both were accessing the same source, the same collective memory of something that really happened 2,000 years ago. With the script ready, Gibson went to Hollywood studios and was systematically rejected. One executive after another looked at that project, a film entirely in Aramaic and Latin without known stars, showing Christ's torture in graphic detail never before seen in cinema, and said no. Some were polite, others brutally honest. No one's going to watch this, Mel. You're going to lose everything. This project will end your career. But Gibson wasn't looking for approval. He was being moved by something greater than commercial logic or box office calculations. So he did the unthinkable. He mortgaged properties. He liquidated investments. He gathered $30 million from his own wealth and announced he would make the film anyway. Without a studio, without a safety net, without a plan B. All or nothing. The choice of Jim Caviezel to play Jesus was not accidental. Gibson had seen the actor in some films and noticed something in him, an intensity in his eyes, an almost ethereal quality in his screen presence. But what really convinced Gibson was when he discovered that Caviezel was a devout, practicing Catholic, someone who took faith as seriously as he did himself. When Gibson offered the role, Caviezel didn't hesitate. But Gibson, in a surprising act of honesty, called him again the next day. Jim, I need to warn you about something. If you accept this role, your Hollywood career is probably over. They're going to blacklist you. You'll never be able to work at the big studios again. Are you sure you want to do this? Caviezel's answer became famous. We all have to carry our cross. Jesus is as controversial today as he was 2,000 years ago. Not much has changed. And with that answer, the actor sealed his fate. He would be Jesus Christ, and he would pay the price for it for the rest of his life, exactly as Gibson had predicted. The preparation for the film was intense in ways few imagine. Caviezel spent months in spiritual retreats. He fasted regularly. He spent hours in prayer. He learned Aramaic, studied the gestures and postures described in historical texts about how Jesus would have moved, spoken, looked. He wasn't just memorizing lines, he was trying to channel something much greater. Gibson assembled an extraordinary technical crew, but did something unusual. He brought religious consultants to the set. Catholic priests who accompanied the filming, offered daily masses for the crew, were available for spiritual conversations. Some production members found this strange at first, but as filming progressed, more and more people began to seek out these spiritual counselors, because strange things began to happen from day one. The chosen location was Matera, Italy, an ancient city carved in stone that seemed to have stopped in time. The narrow alleys, the houses carved into the rock, the arid and mountainous terrain provided the perfect setting to recreate first-century Jerusalem. But Matera had something more, an atmosphere, an energy that many described as heavy, dense, as if the air there carried memories of ancient suffering. Gibson had a full-scale Golgotha built on a hill on the outskirts of the city. Solid wood crosses, stone paths, Roman torture tools recreated with historical precision. Everything needed to be authentic. No plastic, no fiberglass, no shortcuts. If Jesus carried a heavy wooden cross, Caviezel would carry a heavy wooden cross. If the nails were crude iron, the nails in the film would be crude iron. The first weeks of filming were technically challenging, but within expectations. But then the incidents began. Small at first. Equipment that failed without explanation. Cameras that stopped working in the middle of crucial scenes. Lights that exploded. Crew members who suddenly became ill with high fevers that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. And then the real accidents began. During a scene where Caviezel was carrying the cross, the whip that should pass centimeters from his back accidentally struck him. The barbed tip tore his skin, opening a 35-centimeter cut. Real blood gushed out. The screams you hear in the film in that scene are not acting. They are screams of genuine pain, and still, Caviezel insisted on continuing filming. The 70-kilogram cross fell on him during another take, dislocating his shoulder. He developed hypothermia during scenes filmed in intense cold. Pneumonia set in. Doctors on set warned that he needed to stop, rest, recover. But Caviezel refused. He said he needed to finish, that something greater than him was demanding that he complete this journey. Gibson watched all this with a mixture of admiration and growing concern. He began to wonder if he had unleashed something he wasn't prepared to control. If by trying to tell the story of the crucifixion with such authenticity, he had somehow opened a door, and if forces on the other side of that door were responding. What happened during that interrupted crucifixion scene was not an isolated event. It was the climax of weeks of increasingly intense manifestations that had been occurring on the set. Manifestations that the crew tried to rationalize, explain with logic, attribute to fatigue or imagination. But that became impossible to ignore as they accumulated one after another, defying any natural explanation. The day Gibson interrupted the filming of the crucifixion was a day that almost no one talks about, but that marked everyone present indelibly. The preparations had been extensive. Gibson wanted to capture the exact moment of Christ's death with an authenticity no film had achieved before. He had studied medical reports about what happens physiologically during a crucifixion: the slow asphyxiation, the cardiovascular collapse, the final agony. Caviezel had been on the cross for hours. His body was at its limit, dehydrated despite the medical team constantly monitoring, exhausted beyond any normal measure. But his eyes were focused, clear, as if he were in some altered state of consciousness. Some described it as a trance-like gaze, others as a gaze of total surrender. The cameras began to roll. 4 cameras from different angles capturing every detail. The light was perfect, the golden hue of late afternoon creating exactly the atmosphere Gibson wanted. The sound crew was ready, all the technicians in their positions. absolute silence on the set. More than 80 people holding their breath, waiting for that moment that would define the entire film. And then it happened. The temperature plummeted. People saw their own breath condense in the air, impossible under the Mediterranean sun of that late afternoon. The natural light began to pulse, to change intensity in a way that no equipment was causing. The audio meters went crazy, registering sounds that shouldn't be there. And on Caviezel's face, something changed. His eyes widened, but it was no longer Jim Caviezel looking through them. His mouth opened, preparing to speak Christ's last words, but the voice that began to come out was not completely his. It was deeper, more resonant, charged with a weight that made the air vibrate. And it was at that moment that Mel Gibson saw. He saw something his eyes were not prepared to witness. Something so real, so intense, so far beyond the limits of what should be possible on a film set, that he shouted to stop. What happened in the minutes following the interruption of the scene remains one of the best-kept secrets in modern cinema history. Gibson ran toward the cross where Caviezel was hanging. His expression, described by witnesses as a mixture of terror and absolute reverence, made the entire crew realize that something extraordinary had happened, something that completely surpassed the limits of film production. Caviezel was immediately brought down from the cross. When his feet touched the ground, his legs gave way. He couldn't stand. 2 production assistants supported him, but what impressed them was the weight. Caviezel seemed to weigh twice as much as normal, as if something dense, something heavy beyond physical matter, was stuck to him. One of the assistants, a man named Paolo Santini with martial arts experience and accustomed to carrying heavy equipment, described years later in an unpublished interview that it was like trying to hold someone being pulled down by an invisible force. Caviezel's eyes were open, but he didn't seem to be completely present. His gaze was fixed on some distant point that no one else could see. His breathing was shallow, irregular. The medical team ran to examine him. Extremely low blood pressure, body temperature oscillating inexplicably, erratic pulse. But what most disturbed the paramedics was that Caviezel seemed to be experiencing pain in places where there were no wounds. His hands, his feet, his right side, all pulsing with visible agony, but without physical marks to justify that intensity of suffering. Gibson pushed everyone away, except the spiritual consultants he had brought specifically for moments like that. 2 Catholic priests, one of them an experienced exorcist whose identity was never publicly revealed, entered the tent where Caviezel had been taken. They stayed inside for over 30 minutes. No one knows exactly what happened in that tent. But when they came out, the exorcist was pale, sweating profusely despite the climate having returned to normal temperature. He said only one sentence to Gibson before walking away. "You opened a door that should not have been opened." The entire crew was in shock. But Gibson, after consulting with his spiritual advisors, made a decision. Filming would continue, but with fundamental changes. He completely redesigned the configuration of the crucifixion scene. He changed the camera angles so that none of them would focus directly on Caviezel's eyes during the moment of Christ's death. He altered the lighting to create strategic shadows, and most significantly, he brought more spiritual protection to the set. Religious relics were positioned around the scenery. Holy water was sprinkled on each piece of equipment. Specific prayers were recited before each take. Gibson was no longer just making cinema. He was conducting what some crew members described as a spiritual ritual, disguised as film production. When the cameras started rolling again hours later, everything was different. The energy on the set had changed. There was still intensity. There was still a sense that something greater was present. But now there was also structure, containment, as if Gibson had found a way to channel that force without allowing it to completely overflow. The final crucifixion scene that went into the film was powerful, anguishing, one of the most impactful representations of Christ's death ever captured on celluloid. But it wasn't what Gibson had captured in that first, interrupted attempt. That version, those few seconds of filming before he shouted to stop, showed something different. Something he determined the world was not ready to see. The footage from that first take was immediately isolated. The tapes were marked, sealed, and, according to multiple sources, Gibson personally stored them. There are rumors that he watched them only once, alone, late at night in his private editing room, and that after that viewing, he sealed the tapes in a safe that only he has access to. Some suggest he eventually destroyed them, unable to bear the weight of what those images contained. Others believe they still exist, waiting, perhaps, for a time when humanity is more prepared to witness what was captured. But the consequences of that day didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. Caviezel was never the same afterward. He developed serious heart problems that doctors had difficulty explaining. 2 years after filming, he needed open-heart surgery. Another heart surgery followed. He attributed these problems directly to what happened on the set, specifically to the lightning that struck him. But some close to him suggest there was more. That something from that day, something from that experience of channeling such an intense presence, had left deep marks not just on his body, but on his soul. His Hollywood career, exactly as Gibson had predicted, effectively ended. Roles dried up. Offers stopped coming. He was discreetly placed on an industry blacklist. Playing Jesus Christ, and doing so with such conviction and authenticity, had made Caviezel radioactive to the big studios. But he never showed regret. In numerous subsequent interviews, he repeated the same message. It was a privilege. It was a calling. And if he had to do it again, he would. 20 years have passed since that disturbing day on the film set when Mel Gibson shouted to stop the scene. 2 decades during which the Passion of the Christ became a cultural phenomenon impossible to ignore. $612 million in worldwide box office, starting from an investment of $30 million. The most commercially successful religious film of all time. But the numbers tell only a fraction of the story. The true legacy of the Passion of the Christ is not in box office statistics or the controversies it generated. It's in the transformed lives. In the millions of people who entered theaters as curious onlookers and left as believers. In the countless reports of conversions, spiritual healings, family reconciliations, profound life changes that people attribute directly to the experience of watching that film. As if something of what was captured on that set, something of that presence that overflowed during filming, had somehow been impregnated in the celluloid itself, transmitting itself to everyone who watched. There are extraordinary documented stories. A man in California who was planning suicide that same night went to the cinema on impulse, saw the film, and left determined to live, seeking help immediately. A woman in Brazil who had abandoned faith after her son's death was taken by a friend, reluctantly, and during the crucifixion scene felt a tangible presence beside her, an inexplicable comfort that she described as her son saying goodbye and assuring her he was well. Dozens of cases of people with addictions who left the cinema and never touched alcohol or drugs again, describing an instantaneous liberation that defies medical or psychological explanation. Churches around the world reported waves of new faithful after the film's release. Confessionals that had been empty for years suddenly had lines. People who hadn't prayed for decades returned to prayer. And they all told versions of the same story. Something in the film had touched them in a way that transcended entertainment or art. They had found something real in those images, or something real had found them through those images. The few crew members who agreed to talk about the experience, always carefully, always measuring their words, share a common perspective. They weren't just making a film, they were participating in something that had divine purpose. An electrician named Giuseppe Mariani, who worked on the set lighting, said in a rare interview with an Italian religious publication that he believes God allowed that film to be made exactly the way it was made, because humanity needed to be reminded, needed to see, needed to witness the real cost of Christ's sacrifice in a visceral way that centuries of softened paintings and sanitized representations had obscured. But there are also those who don't speak, those who flatly refuse to discuss the experience. Actors with minor roles who politely decline any invitation for interviews about the film. Technicians who changed careers after production and cut all ties with the film industry. A sound editor who worked in post-production and who, according to colleagues, had a nervous breakdown while processing the audio from certain scenes, hearing things in the recordings that shouldn't be there, voices layered beneath the actors' voices, whispers in dead languages, sounds that made his equipment register impossible frequencies. This silence is not shame or fear of ridicule. It's something deeper. It's the silence of those who witnessed something sacred and feel that talking about it would be a profanation. It's the silence of those who carry a secret too heavy to share, but too precious to forget. It's the silence of those who know that some experiences simply cannot be translated into words without losing their essence. And there is, of course, that filmed footage. Those few seconds captured before Gibson interrupted the scene. The footage that was never seen publicly, that perhaps will never be seen. What exactly was in those images that led an experienced director, who had filmed brutal war scenes in Braveheart, who had shown graphic violence in several of his films, to stop everything immediately? What did his eyes see through that camera that was so far beyond what he expected, so far beyond what he was prepared to capture? Speculations abound, of course. Some suggest the camera captured a luminous manifestation, a light emanating from Caviezel that didn't correspond to any lighting source on the set. Others speak of a complete change in the actor's physical appearance, his face transforming into something unrecognizable for those brief seconds. There are even those who suggest in more esoteric circles that what was captured was a direct manifestation, a divine presence making itself visible through the cinematic medium in a way never before recorded in human history. But Gibson never confirmed or denied any of these theories. When pressed in interviews, he simply says that some things are private, that not everything needs to be shared, that there are experiences that are only between you and God. And then he changes the subject, leaving the question suspended in the air like an unanswered prayer. Now, with the sequel in production, many wonder if history will repeat itself. Gibson is 59 years old now, older, supposedly wiser, certainly more cautious. He went through his own personal hell in the years since the Passion. He was publicly broken, humiliated, cancelled, and somehow found his way back. Not to the same position of prestige in Hollywood he had before, that will never return, but to something perhaps more important, an acceptance of who he is, with all his flaws, and an understanding of the role he was called to play. In recent interviews about the sequel, Gibson has been careful but firm. He describes the new film as even more ambitious than the original. An acid trip, were his words on Joe Rogan's podcast. The script explores not only the resurrection, but Christ's descent into the realm of the dead, the harrowing of hell as it's known in Christian tradition. 3 days between the cross and the empty tomb. 3 days in which Christ supposedly descended to the depths of hell to free the souls of the righteous who had died before his coming. How do you film that? How do you visually represent a journey through spiritual realms? Gibson admits he's not sure he can, that the project scares him, that there are nights when he wakes up questioning whether he's ready, whether he'll ever be ready, to open that door again. But he feels he needs to try, that the story demands to be told, that there's a reason why, 2 decades later, he's still alive, still working, still has the ability to make this film. Caviezel, now 56 years old, also speaks about returning to the role with a mixture of anticipation and something that looks very much like reverent fear. He knows the price he paid last time, the heart problems, the destroyed career, the permanent marks left not just on his body but on his spirit. And yet, he says yes. He returns. Because, in his words, some callings you simply cannot refuse, even when you know it's going to cost everything. The spiritual team this time will be even larger. Gibson learned from the previous experience. He's not going to enter this territory without maximum spiritual protection. Exorcists will be present from day one. Masses will be held not just regularly, but before each significant scene. Sacred relics from various Christian traditions will be strategically positioned around the set. He's preparing not just to make a film, but to enter a spiritual battleground. And perhaps that's exactly what the Passion of the Christ always was. Not just a film, but a battlefield. A meeting point between light and darkness, between forces that want the truth to be revealed and forces desperate to keep it hidden. Gibson, Caviezel, and everyone who worked on that production became soldiers in that war, whether they wanted to or not. The scripture in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 12 to 13, reminds us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And perhaps that's what Gibson was witnessing that day when he interrupted the filming. Not just an actor playing Jesus, but a window momentarily opening to that cosmic battle that happens constantly around us, invisible to the eyes, but devastatingly real. The final legacy of the Passion of the Christ may not be measurable in box office dollars or conversion statistics. It may simply be this, that a generation was reminded that the sacred is real, that the supernatural is not fiction, that there are forces operating in dimensions beyond our common perception, and that sometimes, in rare and precious moments, the veil between worlds becomes thin enough to glimpse what's on the other side. And for those who were there, for those who witnessed, for those who carry the visible and invisible marks of that experience, there is no doubt. Something real happened on that set. Something that transcended cinema, art, entertainment, and entered the territory of miracle and mystery. Something that Gibson saw through his camera at that moment and that made him shout to stop. Not because he was afraid, but because he was before the sacred and knew that not everything sacred should be captured, reproduced, exhibited. Some mysteries must remain mysteries. Some doors, once opened, reveal truths so vast that our human minds can barely begin to process them. And perhaps that's exactly what those few seconds of lost footage contained. A truth too large to fit on a screen. A presence too real to be reduced to entertainment. A moment when the eternal burst into the temporal in a way so pure and intense that all Gibson could do was protect it, guard it, keep it safe away from eyes that weren't yet ready to see. If these revelations awakened something in your spirit, show it by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing in the comments how God has manifested in your own life. Your testimony can touch the heart of someone who needs this message exactly today. Join our community of truth seekers and continue with us on this journey of spiritual discoveries that can change your life forever. The battle between light and darkness continues, and each of us has a role to play in it. The question is not whether you'll be affected by this spiritual war, but which side you'll choose to be on when the moment of decision arrives.